just want to thank everyone for being with us today. Particularly, I want to thank Pam. We've been working on this for 8 months or something at this point, right?
It seems like forever.
And this conversation has come out of our work as the CAUSRO group within the Board of Justice, just wanting as a commission on the status and role of women to make sure we are hearing where women are coming through everywhere we've come through with these days of pandemic. And now I'm at a loss, or what do we say? Is it over, not over? How has it affected and changed our lives? What support did we get and not get? How can we support each other? What can we learn? And we had this conversation among ourselves, and we said, why are we generating this conversation among our own commission? Why don't we find a way to hear from women around the conference and men? Thank you, Eric. Good to see you. And also to partner with Pam, which is just great, with General CAUSRO, and have her input, because there's so many wonderful resources that exist that I have to say we often forget about, or don't know about, or are not pointed toward. And if we're tired, it's hard to find those on our own. So we just wanted to invite her. And she also has a presentation from a WestPath partner as well. So I think we're really going to hear we will be equipped well to begin to move to a different place than maybe where we are today. And I know for me today, I'm arriving at a place where I really need this conversation. So thank you very much, Pam. And thank you to everyone for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, and welcome everyone. And we're looking forward to our conversation as we continue today. I'm going to share my screen to begin the presentation. But before I do, I just want to also let you know that a counterpart of mine, a colleague at WestPath, Reverend Shelley Brooks Sanford, is partnering with me on today's session. And unfortunately, she wasn't able to be present, but she was kind enough to prepare a video presentation for us. And so you'll get a chance to meet her through the video. And I think you will enjoy the work and materials that she put together. So let me start off by sharing my screen. And what we're going to be talking about today is a project that our agency has produced called The Way of Integrity. And it's really titled that, Living in Right Relationship with Self, Others, and God. This particular project, I believe, or resource, if you will, comes through deep exploration of scripture and other resources. And as a result of doing so, we'll be able to, when you go through all of the lessons, which we won't do today, you'll begin to make intentional efforts to how you care for your own core values and how they're lived out in your everyday life. And so one of the things that Christy was sharing with me is how people are burnt out and how people are feeling stress. And I think we all are, because to some extent, this pandemic is leaving us with a languishing feeling where we just don't know when it's going to ever be over. This protracted pandemic has been really challenging for all of us. And as a result, many times we're not taking care of ourselves, we're not taking care of others, and we're certainly not taking care of our relationships with God. And so in hopes, this project, which you can find on our website, will be something that will help you align your values with who you say and believe you truly are, so that as you walk through your lives each and every day, those things that you value and care the most about will be reflected in your ways in which you live. So let's get right started. And let me move this ribbon so I can, I always hate when this thing is in my way. Begin the slideshow. Can you see my screen, or is it still hidden? Can you see it?
I can see it.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Everybody's nodding and I'm like, but I can't hear you. I can't see you. Okay, so that's what this project is about. So let's go ahead and get started. The Book of Discipline states that one of our responsibilities as an agency includes providing leadership and resources for the prevention of sexual misconduct. The integrity curriculum was initially created in response to those types of inquiries regarding resources for clergy and laity that can address poor relationship building and a lack of respect in ministry settings. So in other words, have you noticed the hostility that a lot of people seem to exhibit when they're interacting with one another? You can, yeah, I mean, it's almost as if people aren't civil anymore. They're not kind anymore. They aren't, willing to, work with people anymore. So you have to question, when you see those kinds of behaviors, how much of it is resulting from what's on the inside of us and reflecting outward how we feel about ourselves, how we feel about the world we're living in, because people seem to have forgotten simple acts of kindness, respect, and civility. I would argue that that is by no way by happenstance. That is reflective of all of our, ways in which we are living out our personal lives and our callings. So the way of integrity is one of the most character defining attributes a person can have. It defines who you are and what you stand for. It determines your ability to stay grounded and true to your values in difficult times, or even in the best of times, I would argue. And I will go ahead and let you finish reading that. But one of the legacies we will leave when our time on this earth is done is our character. Maya Angelou said it best. People may not always remember what you did, but they will remember how you made them feel. That's a profound statement, because how do you make others feel? How do you feel about yourself? Each of us has to decide what our character is going to be, and whether we choose to engage with others from a place of integrity will strongly influence what our character will be. So we're going to do some theological grounding in just a moment. This is why we're talking about, our role as in United Methodists and Christians means that we want to consistently, faithfully, reliably act with the honor, humility, and helpfulness that we've seen in Jesus's ministry. Pardon me. So this woman was photographed by Dorothea Lange. My colleague, Becky Williams, found this picture, and she described it as an accurate reflection of how oftentimes in life we find ourselves in that space between how the world is and how we want it to be. This space can be an invitation. How are we going to respond? Because essentially, what we want the world around us to look like is a direct reflection on what it is on the inside of us. So if we're burnt out, if we're feeling stressed, if we're always angry or upset, that's going to be reflected in our behavior, which really has a ripple effect into how the world is. Does this picture bring up any thoughts, concerns? How does it resonate with you? And we're going to be in conversation, so this is not meant to be a monologue. So please tell me, what do you see when you look at this picture? Are you all there? All right, let's go on.
Well, wait a moment. How do you want us to do this? Do you want us to raise our hands or just blurt things out? How do you want
please blurt things out, because I've got the PowerPoint on full screen, so I can't see you. I can only hear you. So I apologize. I should have said that.
No worries at all. You look at this woman and you look at her eyes, and you can see the anguish that she's feeling. And this sort of a light has gone out, like, what do I do? And then the two children that are hugging her, the one with the extremely dirty hands, and they're just, you want to cry. You really do want to cry, because what can I do? And I don't know if I can do anything. And so the reaction, the first time I saw this, was to look away because it was too painful. I think we were reading Grapes of Wrath or something in school, and this was shown, and I didn't want to look.
That's powerful. Anyone else, please jump in.
I guess for me, it makes me think about that place where emotional, spiritual distress begins to take a physical toll on us. I mean, I'm sure she's much younger than she looks, and I'm looking at all those lines on her forehead, and I'm just thinking that's where it is, that exhaustion in her eyes, and she carries her, emotional, spiritual burdens physically.
Yes, yes. Take notice of the fact that the children are facing in the opposite direction. It's as if they can't face what she's being forced as the adult in this photo to observe. How the world seems harsh and cold to them, and how she has to struggle to find a way to face it because they're leaning on her. Sometimes we all feel like that, don't we?
Yeah.
The world seems harsh, cold, challenging, and we look around and we see our children, our families, our parents who may be aging that are leaning on us to support them. And yet we have fear in our eyes, worry lines in our forehead and in our cheeks, and we don't know what to do. I'm going to go on.
Our mission is to plant ourselves at the gates of hope, not the prudent gates of optimism, which are somewhat narrower, nor the stalwart, boring gates of common sense, nor the strident gates of self-righteousness, which creak on shrill and angry hinges, nor the cheerful, flimsy garden gate of everything is going to be all right, but a very different, sometimes very lonely place, the place of truth-telling about your own soul, first of all, and its condition, the place of resistance and defiance, the piece of ground from which you see the world both as it is and as it could be, as it might be, as it will be, the place from which you glimpse not only struggle, but joy in the struggle. And we stand there, all of us, beckoning and calling, telling people what we are seeing, asking people what they see.
Mhm. So that poem, as you can see, was written by Victoria Stafford, and it was read by Parker Palmer. Some of you might be very familiar with Parker Palmer's work, very profound and prolific writer, I might add. But this poem was describing that space between what is and what we think it should be or could be, that liminal space of indecision and lack of clarity and assuredness. And it's difficult because I think that's why this time of this, what I call protracted pandemic, has made us all feel a little burnout. And many of us, our hope is getting dimmer and dimmer and dimmer. So this project, The Way of Integrity, has two components. And so we're not going to get through the entire session of one today because there are some parts of it that I think work better in person. So I wanted to give you a glimpse of this project. And then I hope that you will go to our website. You can download the whole thing and use it in your small group practices or even in your own individual study, because it's a great piece of work that might help all of us, I believe, live better, live well, and to walk in integrity where our values are consistent with what we do and think and say. So there are individual participants' reflections on intentional action. There are guiding questions at the conclusion of each session. And then there are, within these sessions, the group comes together for study and reflection. So each section, and there are 4 of them, contains 4 components: the centering piece, sharing, reflecting, and acting. And the one thing that I like about it is the flexibility with each of these sessions or lessons, if you will. You can choose to do them however works for you. And that makes it easy. If you've got 2 or 3 people in a group, or if you've got 30 people in a group, you can use this piece for however many persons are present. And you can break each session down. We have 4 sessions, but you may decide we're only going to do part 1, half of part 1, and then we'll do the other part later. So where it's 4 sessions, you can make it 8, you can make it 10, you can make it 12. But it's really, really good work. This particular project was inspired by the Emory Integrity Project at Emory University. And some of you may have heard about that. So the resources include, as I was saying, materials for small groups or individuals, but there are also some sermons in there, or what might be considered sermon starters for someone who wants to use that as a foundation to create their own messages. This can be used in campus ministries, youth groups, local church groups, whatever works for you. This project is really, really good at being adaptable to whatever the group is. There are some guiding questions that come out of these sessions or lessons, and in particular, the one we're doing today, number 1, can people identify your personal values based on the way you live and act? As a person of faith, why is acting with moral courage important in order to live according to the integrity of Christ? And when someone disagrees with your point of view, do you think it's important to change their minds or to listen to their view? And how is the love of neighbor, love of God, I would even say, and love of self related to living with integrity, to honor and moral courage, humility and helpfulness? These guiding questions will frame each of the 4 sessions within this project. So today we're working on session 1, and the goals are reflected there on the screen. So I want to just give everyone a moment to read through that. As we move forward, I'd like to invite you to enter a more reflective attitude as we go forward. If you need to just take a few deep breaths and just begin to center yourself as we move forward through the rest of this presentation, that is an appropriate thing to do. And I want you to answer this question as we move forward through these slides. Can people identify your personal values based on the ways you live and act? And let's even take it further by asking, can I see your love of yourself by how well you maintain your values and integrity to live, love, and be well in your actions? Can I see how much you love yourself in how you live every day? I ask that question because many times we wear masks. And if someone says, how are you today? We always say, fine, I'm doing well. In reality, that may not be true. So if we're not loving ourselves, isn't it going to be a little harder to love neighbor, loving God? So when we think about burnout, being tired, exhausted, feeling this sense of languishing around the times that we're living in, how much is our love of self reflected in how we feel? When we, don't take care of our self-care, when we don't make time for quietness, when we don't make time to be out in nature, when we don't make time to watch what we eat or watch what we look at on TV and determine if that's healthy or not, if we don't take time to take care of our bodies, are those places where we're not doing those things a reflection of our self-love? How do we get back on track? So we're going to do a little bit of Lectio Divina, just briefly, very abbreviated version, I might say. And I'm going to use this particular text from Mark, the 12th chapter. What I'd like to do is to ask someone to read the scripture for us just one time, and then I'll read it from there. But we're going to have 3 readings. And in the first, I'm going to ask you a question. And then the second reading, after I've read it a second time, I'm going to ask you an additional question. And then the third time you've read this scripture, we've read it, I'm going to ask you a final question. As we're listening to this text being read, what word speaks to you? What word jumps out in your heart, your spirit? What phrase kind of sticks to your heart that makes you think or pause even? So if someone, Christy, if you could just read that for me the first time, as everyone thinks about this question now, what word is God speaking to me through this text? And Christy, if you would read that, I'd appreciate it.
Sure. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength. The second is this: love your neighbor as yourself. There is no commandment greater than these.
Thank you. What word is God speaking to you or stands out to you? You don't have to say it out loud right now. I'm going to go back and ask if anyone feels comfortable sharing. But for right now, just on a piece of paper, jot down the word that jumps out at you. Now, Christy, if you could read it one more time.
Sure. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength. The second is this: love your neighbor as yourself. There is no commandment greater than these.
How is your life touched by this passage? How is your life touched by this passage? How is your life touched? Just jot it down on a piece of paper. Type it into your phone if you're a digital person. But how is your life touched by this phrase, this scripture? I'm going to read it one more time for the last time. And I'm going to be asking you to consider this question: what is this passage inviting me to do or be in my life? What is this passage inviting me to do or be in my life? And here's the third reading. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength. The second is this: love your neighbor as yourself. There is no commandment greater than these. What is the passage inviting me to do or be in my life? Now, give you a second or two to process, and then I want to open up the floor for conversation. We'll go back to the first question. What word is God speaking to you from this text? Anyone can share. What is the word, when we read it the first time, that you believe God was speaking to you? What stood out?
Strength.
Strength. That's good.
Love.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else?
Strength.
Okay. Let me ask the second question. After the second reading, how is your life touched by this passage?
The admonition to love your neighbor as yourself, which assumes that you cannot love your neighbor if you are not loving yourself.
Mhm. Mhm. Anyone else? Okay, the third question, the final question. What is Christ inviting you to do or be in this passage?
To love with all your heart and all your soul.
Yes. Yes. So let me say something that I want you to think about. The key is love. The key is love. You can't do anything without love. And scripture tells us what about love? God is love. You can't love yourself without God. You can't love your neighbor without God. You can't even love God without God. And so many times we're blinded by the natural world in which we live, and we forget about the fact that it takes God to love your neighbor. It takes God to love yourself. And if we lack in self-love, we're going to lack in self-care, and we're going to lack in loving of others, and we will lack in our love of God. Do you see the connection? I can't see you. You have to talk. I can't see you. Sorry.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So I say that when we think about how do we get past this place where we feel as though we're just tired, burnt out, stressed out, we've got to get back to a place where we love God and we allow God's love to give us a place in which we can love ourselves and others. Thank you for participating in this abbreviated version of Lectio Divina today. So, communal grounding. I have this here because I think it's important for us to think in terms of where we are as a group together. So let's take a moment and read this, and we'll do it. I won't read it out to you. Okay. I think we went through that last question. Why does Jesus relate our love of God and ourselves to loving our neighbors? I think we several of you hit on it. In particular, I think it may have been you, Jeanette, that said something about the admonition to love your neighbor as you love yourself. It's all connected. Again, another piece of communal grounding. How do we want to be treated, and why do we want to be treated this way? What do we value? Knowing one's values helps determine what's important and why we act in the way that we do and think the way we do. So this session is to invite you to reflect deeply on your personal values. And many times that's hard to do because we don't always want to reflect deeply. And so that's why this one is, taking a little bit more time. We're moving a little bit slower because we want to make sure we can digest and process as we move along. And then it helps us to identify the source of our values and determine how our values influence us. So when we consider Jesus' life, ministry, and teachings and how they serve as a model for living our lives, therein lies integrity. And so as we move forward and understand our values, it's important to keep that connection before us, that our values guide our ethical decisions, and that in turn is how we act and think and why. And so when we think about loving God, loving self and neighbor, we've got to think about where is the love. So when we think about this particular project, I like this word cloud. I like it's, it has a lot of words that we think about that oftentimes we're so consumed by etiquette, performance, being considered worthy, responsible, being fair and having the appropriate conduct. I mean, some of these words, I don't know about you all, but they just sort of, they make us live our lives with our head high and our shoulders back. And that weight of trying to live up to these, conventionalities, if you will, oftentimes is a weight. And therein lies our frustration and our feeling of being tired and worn out and exhausted. So as we walk through some of this stuff, we'll be talking about how, these values are reflected by ourselves in our families, our communities, schools, and our churches. And as Christians, many of our shared values come from studying the life and teachings of Jesus Christ as recorded in Scripture. So when we think about the various roles that we all play, we look in here, you see a mother, we see a pastor, we see a business person, and we have all these different responsibilities and obligations and expected behaviors. It's a lot sometimes, is it not? So sometimes we have to be more than one of these people. I mean, I can imagine I'm a pastor, I'm a mother too, and I'm a business person too. And I'm sure I am not, the only one in this session today who has to wear multiple hats every day. And just shifting gears from all of that in and of itself can be very, very exhausting because you're all of these things simultaneously. Wow. I hope I'm not making you more tired when you think about all that you've got to do. So making good decisions is complicated and it requires paying attention to the facts, context, roles, and values. And as people of faith, it's important when we're facing decisions, particularly ethical decisions, that we pause and ask ourselves a few questions. What role am I playing right now in this situation? What values are at stake in my decision based on my role? And we're talking about self-care as well. So how am I playing out, taking those calls well after business hours because I'm trying to be effective and show that I'm committed, I'm responsible, and these are the expectations that are placed on me by all these various roles, but it's burning us out. How many times are we meeting on Saturdays and Sundays after church when we probably need to rest? How many times are we taking on additional responsibilities because we want to keep the trains on the track, knowing that it's wearing us down? That's where integrity comes in, because it's consistently, faithfully, and reliably acting with honor, humility, and helpfulness seen in Jesus' ministry, both towards ourselves and towards others. So it's not just enough to just say, okay, I've got to wear all these hats, I've got all this stuff I have to do. We have to be thinking about, am I living out the values I believe when I'm stressing myself out, when I'm taking on more than I can handle, when I'm not taking appropriate vacation time, I'm not giving myself the time and space in which I can relax and just relieve myself of all the burden of everything that's concerning me at times? If we have integrity, when we get that little sense that we need to slow down, we will slow down. You remember Jesus went up into the mountains to rest, right? He went to the gardens to rest. He knew about Sabbath. He understood that. So why are we working ourselves so hard? Why are we doing that?
Can I say something? Is it Pirtle?
Absolutely.
All
Uh-huh.
right. So here's the dilemma that I think that most of us face in terms of the question of the difference between being faithful to what it is that you have to do and where does the selfishness lie? Like if I just need to take a break, is that because I'm really worn out or I just don't want to be bothered with the task that's been presented to me? And that's the dilemma that I think that most of us have when we look at the question of integrity.
Mm. That's a good one. Anyone else want to chime in on that before I make a comment?
Yes. One of the things the pandemic has done is made you wonder how in the world you did what you did prior to the pandemic. How
You're
did we
right.
do that? How did we work 60 hours a week and go home and take care of our families? We even found out things about our children and our families that we didn't know because we didn't have time. And
Mhm.
so I think one thing the pandemic did was to stop us. It stopped us. And that's the way I tell my kids, you know what? God made us all take a break and made our priorities change and made us see what's important. I have
Yeah.
used more vacation time since the pandemic than I ever did before the pandemic.
Mm. Mhm.
So it changed my way of thinking, and I still don't know how I did what I did prior to the pandemic.
Mhm. I think many of us prior to the pandemic were on autopilot. We were,
I want to challenge that a little bit to say that in my role as a lay staff member, I thought I had pretty good boundaries between work and home prior to the pandemic. And in my
Mhm.
role here, those boundaries went away.
Yeah.
I was one of the staff people, the lay staff members that went into overdrive during the pandemic. Besides the pastors, I was the one, pastor's custodian and me. And
Mhm.
so I, on the opposite, have not found my way off from that train we talked about yet. Um, and so I am just starting to be able to step back to pre-pandemic boundaries. The work is definitely not the same.
Mhm. Mhm.
But I'm finally figuring out some of the new role, et cetera. So my struggle in this time is figuring out how to move forward because I can't go back. But how to go forward and be able to maintain the expectations in the post-pandemic space.
You've raised a good point, Kim, because I remember, and I struggle with this at times too. But when we came home, we were on that shutdown. Everyone had to go home, and we packed up all of our stuff, thinking we'd be out for a few days, and we found out we weren't going back for several months, and then we ended up, having to be at home. What has it been? Almost 3 years now, and as a result of that, I found my dog sits at my feet, when I'm in my office or even at my dining table. And my daughter, when she came home from college, she said, "Is that what you do all day?" Sitting in front of your computer. And I didn't realize I might not shut down until 8 or 9 o'clock. And I started at 9 o'clock in the morning. That's a 12-hour day. When I was having to go into an office, it had to end at some point because I wanted to go home and have dinner for my kid or whatever. So you're right. I think you've made a great point that in many ways the pandemic has made us work harder. And I think that a lot of it had to do, and maybe my perspective is different, but a lot of it, I believe, had to do with the fact that we were all trying to scramble to figure out, our worth, and how do we maintain the work that needs to be done when we are now being forced to work from home in individual space. There was just a lot of confusion. And I can understand what you mean about how the boundaries seem to get lost, because if you were like me, many days you would just, you might go to eat lunch at 2 o'clock and come back to your work around 3 or 3:30, and you might sit there for another 4 hours. And now it's 7 o'clock at night and you're just finishing up your work. That's something. And people sending you emails and text messages and phone calls at 7 o'clock in the morning, as if, it's appropriate to do that. Whereas when you were in the office, everybody would arrive between 8 and 9, and that would be the earliest you see or hear from anybody. Now we just don't have boundaries like that anymore. People are texting and calling and emailing at all times of the day and night. So we have to talk about that. How do we get back to a level of productivity that's reasonable? Because I don't know that we could ever go back to the way things really were. I think this is a new normal.
I think it's a matter of training. It's like we have to retrain ourselves and others on what is an appropriate expectation or workload, work level, days of work, times of work. My personal cell phone, personal email, like those are not, they're not personal anymore. Everything is free. It's like if I gave somebody my personal cell phone number in the time of the pandemic, well, now it's free for all, and so it's expected that I will answer that, at all times of the day. So I think but at least personally, I've gotten myself into that. Well, I have to answer it. I have to be there. I have to be available because, nobody else is going to do it. So I think that retraining of, we are not necessarily always need to be in crisis mode.
Yes.
Still.
We're not saving lives, right?
Yeah. I mean, we are, but not
that way.
not in that way. But I think maybe that's the word I've been looking for. It's that I feel like I've been functioning in crisis mode for 2 years, 3 years.
Yeah.
How do we get off that? How do we get off that path?
And so that's why I believe this integrity project, the way of integrity, is to really align yourself with what matters. If family matters to you, if taking care of your body matters to you, and I'm not suggesting that anyone would say they don't care, but we may say we take care of our bodies, that's important to me, and then we eat everything we know we shouldn't eat. We don't exercise, we don't, and so I believe that the concept around having integrity means every part of our lives, even the things that most people think don't matter. Having integrity is not just about how honest I am in my dealings with you or other people. It's about how honest am I about dealing with myself and God. And when I say honest, I'm not just talking about telling the truth. I'm speaking in terms of, if I believe that this is important, whatever that might be, does my life reflect that being a high priority? And I think boundaries are one of those things, because, like you said, you answer the phone because they now have your number and they're going to call you, or you're going to have to look at an email. I'm one of those people who's tethered to my phone most of the time. And over the past few months, I've tried to learn not to be so. I deliberately leave it in another room. I deliberately have left home without it, which is kind of scary, but I have, just because I want to disconnect. No suggestions here, but because it may not work for everybody. But these
But
are some.
I think the problem is we don't give ourselves permission to do that. And we fight with that savior role, thinking that we're the ones to fix it all, to do it all, to be it all.
Yes.
And trying to convince our congregations that we're not Jesus either. So I think it's all of it wrapped into it, and both sides of the pandemic, and there's not or, it's just always and
yeah.
And we're the only ones who can give ourselves the grace. God has already given it to us. We need to accept it and move into it.
That's exactly
Well,
right.
We've got to modify that song. I think we're all still singing that song, that I'm every woman. And it doesn't mean that you got to do everything all the time. And the company I work for is stressing work-life balance. And I didn't believe them when we're still on a hybrid schedule.
Mhm.
3 days in the office, 2 days at home. And trust me, I have trained myself to turn off that computer and that phone at 5 o'clock.
Mm.
Done at 5 o'clock.
That's some real integrity right there.
And whether I'm in the office, if I'm in the office, of course I'm leaving at 5, but it wasn't always that way because we worked over if we felt we had the option of doing that. But I don't do that. At 5, I go home. If I'm home, then I turn off that computer. I'm done. If you send me a message at 5:30 and 6 o'clock, I won't see it until I log back on the next morning. But I had to train myself to do that. I had to train myself to stop canceling my doctor's appointments to do stuff for other people.
Mm.
I had to train myself to get up and go out and walk for myself or just take some time to do absolutely nothing.
Mhm.
It's not something you can just say you're going to do it and then you get up tomorrow and you do it. You have to train yourself to do it because that's what I had to do. I had to train myself to do it.
Yeah.
So all I'm saying is that if I'm working from home, whatever, at 5 o'clock, I'm done.
Wow, that's excellent. That's excellent. And I think if we could all operate with that level of discipline around our own self-care needs, we all be in a better space. Because I think about this, what are some of the values you've learned from your parents as it relates to self-care? Well, for some of us, our parents never talked about self-care. And we may have, when we watched the lives that they modeled before us, we may not have seen that as a priority for them either, which makes it hard for us to just, sit back and breathe sometimes, and just sit back and take the space and the time that we need for ourselves. Because we always saw our parents, some of us, working all the time. When they came home, they was busy about taking care of making sure the kids are fed and doing this homework and then getting the baths and getting them into bed. So we learned this behavior over our lifetime. And now the pandemic, as someone said, it stopped us. And it made us take inventory of how hard we were working. Or for some of us, it flipped it to where the balance we previously had now got shifted into overdrive. And here we are 3 years later, for however way you came into the pandemic, exhausted. We're exhausted. And it's also about the values you've learned from other people who were part of your lives when you grew up, and how did they teach you to live in community with others? Did it matter if you lived in community with others? But more importantly, what values are most important to you? And I oftentimes think about, as being a pastor too, the conflict between the expectations of your role and your values. I mean, I have clergy friends who turn their phones off every night by 7. And then others, I've been one to do this, taking calls, running to the hospital at 2 and 3 in the morning. How do we establish appropriate boundaries so that we're not, in my case, leaving a 15-year-old at home alone because one of my primary members had a heart attack in the middle of the night? Okay. So let's be reconciled back to who we are trying to be so that we can be healed. Let's read this together. Blessed are those who are willing to enter into the process of being healed, for they will become healers. Blessed are those who recognize their own inner violence, for they will come to know nonviolence. Blessed are those who can forgive self, for they will become forgivers. Blessed are those who are willing to let go of selfishness and self-centeredness, for they will become a healing presence. Blessed are those who listen with compassion, for they will become compassionate. Blessed are those who are willing to enter into conflict, for they will find resolutions. Blessed are those who know their interdependence with all of creation, for they will become unifiers. Blessed are those who live a contemplative life stance, for they will find God in all things. Blessed are those who strive to live these beatitudes, for they will become reconcilers. Jesus is laying out in the Beatitudes that we're all familiar with a model for how we might live, how we might care for ourselves, others, and relate to others. He provides the model for living with integrity by identifying the values his followers ought to possess and proclaiming that God's favor, blessings, will be upon those who live by these values in their actions toward themselves and others. As followers of Jesus, living with integrity means embodying these values in our relationships with ourselves first and primary. And then we can move on to others and God. Though these Beatitudes of reconciliation were written many years ago by the Sisters of St. Joseph of Concordia, Kansas, they are widely quoted by many groups, especially those focusing on self-care and unity. As we begin to move from this portion of the session into the West Path piece, I just want to offer up this word of prayer for everyone, if you would read this. And it simply says, God, help us to let go of our own egos so that we may truly discover what our values are, why we think how we think, and why we do what we do. Open our ears so that we can hear you. Open our eyes so we can see your presence. Open our minds so that we may more deeply know you and to know ourselves. Open our hearts so we can better hear others, and open our lives so we can become a sign and instrument of your presence in the world. I believe that the more we are connected to the lifeline, which is God's love of self, God, and others, the better we will show up in the world. Because if I don't love Pam, I cannot love you. If I don't take care of Pam, I can't take care of you. But if I can find a way to create appropriate boundaries, and it can be just little things, such as I'm not going to check my email at 6 o'clock in the morning before I rise, or as I'm rising. I'm going to wait until after breakfast at 8. If it's simple things such as I'm not going to take calls or read emails after 5 or 6 o'clock in the evening. Someone said they shut everything off at 5. That's excellent. I'm getting there. I'm going to get there. Because I believe that those kinds of boundaries create the space for us to be refreshed and renewed by the Spirit of God. When we don't make those kinds of boundaries in our lives, we leave ourselves open, as the scriptures might say, being tossed to and fro by the waves. We don't want to live like that anymore. I don't want to live like that anymore. And I don't know about some of you, but I want to be able to walk in a sense of peace, where every day is a good day and no problem is too hard for me and God to solve, because I'm refreshed, I'm energized, I'm focused, I'm committed, I'm dedicated. And at the end of the day, I'm going to make sure I'm healthy and in a good space, right? And so I just encourage everyone to live in that way. So I want to go back and just share, I'll share the scripture again that we opened up with, and that is that we have to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. The second is this: love your neighbor as yourself. There is no commandment greater than these. Remember these questions, and we talked about what is God calling me to do with this text, with this passage, what you've learned today. How might I incorporate this into my everyday life? How might I live in such a way that my love of God, myself, and others is reflected in all I say and do? And then this quote by John Donahue, which I think is awesome. Each of us is an artist of our days. The greater our integrity and awareness, the more original and creative our time will become. Some of you may be familiar with this, to bless the space between us. All right, I'm going to stop sharing. Are there any questions at this point, or can I go on to the next presentation by my colleague, Shelley Brooks Sanford? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and pull hers up and we'll watch that.
I'm Shelley Brooks Sanford, Population Health Manager with WestPath Benefits and Investments. And it's so good to be with you today. I wish I was able to be with you live, but since that is not possible, I do hope that this recording will still be a help and a blessing to you. I want to share just a little bit about what we have learned here at WestPath about clergy health and well-being. Now, I know that not all of you listening today are clergy, yet if you are involved in the church and the church's life, I expect many of the same issues and stresses that affect clergy also affect you as well, at least indirectly. Here at WestPath, every other year, we conduct what we call a clergy well-being survey. And this is a survey of random United Methodist clergy across the United States, includes single, married, large church, small church, different ethnic groups, to try to get a good cross section of the clergy who are currently serving. This last one was done in early 2019. And one of the things that we learned, unfortunately, is that it seems the many stresses from the pandemic, from the stresses and things going on in the denomination itself, as well as the stresses in our society as a whole, seem to be having an effect on our clergy. We've unfortunately seen some decline in the overall well-being of clergy in several different dimensions. We wanted to do what we could to respond to this situation and offer additional supports to clergy and also those who help to support the clergy and work with them. So one of the things that we did earlier in 2022 was to offer a series of webinars titled First Aid for Mental Health. Now, although these webinars have been concluded, the recordings are still available on our westpath.org website. So I hope that you might consider accessing those. We had a really excellent speaker and excellent virtual attendance at these webinars. One of the concepts that was shared at these was that of a stress container, and I found this concept helpful. We all have a stress container, and as you would think, it can only hold so much. We need to keep that in mind and be aware of what the level is at any given moment in our own personal stress container. Now, we also have a conscious filter that hopefully, when working at its best, can allow some stressful events or things to just simply roll off like water off a duck's back and not actually enter our stress container. For example, my husband and I were at the store the other day. We were sacking up our groceries, and a sharp edge of some packaging tore the sack that we were putting the groceries in, and of course, everything fell out. Things like that just happen. Sometimes too often, and it doesn't necessarily mean that the universe is against us somehow. But being able to have that conscious filter to allow some things to just roll off. Now, it's also important that we have some means of letting some of that stress drain off on a regular basis. So you may see that little green tap at the bottom that represents some coping mechanisms, some habits that we can engage in to help let go of some of that stress so that we don't reach full capacity. So what are some of those strategies that we can use? Well, we work some with Duke Divinity School, which is one of our Methodist seminaries. And they've done some excellent research through their Clergy Health Initiative. They did a study which was completed in 2019. And in that study, they were able to identify some factors that help separate those who seem to be experiencing a lot of burnout and struggling with their mental health from a smaller group who seem to just really manage to flourish, even amid similar stresses. So they called these people super flourishers. And they found that they seem to have 4 defining behaviors and attitudes. So what might these be? The first one, number 1, creating boundaries. I don't know about you, but I have heard this one frequently about how important it is to all of us. And I expect many of you in the audience are women, and it seems like many of us almost have a mechanism for taking on more and too much. So creating boundaries is so very important. There are days that I'm good at it, days that I'm just not good. But many of us with the pandemic moved to doing more of our work at home. And there's pluses to that, in that there may not be the long commute perhaps, but it also tends to create a lot of blurring between our work and our home life. One of the things that I've fortunately been able to do is set up my office upstairs in an upstairs room. So I can almost consciously think, okay, whenever I go down the stairs, that's home life. Whenever I go up the stairs, that's work life. But sometimes even physical boundaries like that can be helpful. They also found that these super flourishers really worked hard to schedule meetings just one night per week, so that they could get those meetings done on that one night and then have those other evenings for family time or other self-care needs. They also regularly communicate to others around them when they are going to be taking time off, such as in an email signature or voice messages. And then they follow through and actually say no to requests that are made of them during that time off. I know that Pam has just shared with you some about the importance of identifying our values, living with integrity. It's also important that we communicate those values and our priorities to those whom we work with, our families, those whom we may volunteer with, just so they have a better understanding of what's most important to us and who we are. Super Flourishers also set a stop time in the evenings for answering calls or emails. Again, setting a time boundary. They also found that they put almost everything on their calendar, even small things like time for taking a walk. And it's just already there on their calendar and reminds them to follow through. The second practice of Super Flourishers they found is intentional health behaviors. So they make a plan, but then they also make a plan B or a plan C if needed in order to attend to their own health and well-being. So if plan A doesn't work, for example, if there was a plan to go to the gym, to work out or do an exercise class, but that doesn't work out for some reason, then they go to plan B and take a walk or do some yoga themselves at home. The point is to be very intentional, but also be flexible in how we approach those self-care practices. Some other thoughts to consider in this regard are to maybe change up our approach to eating out or eating at gatherings. One thing my husband and I are doing more often is asking for a takeout box at restaurants so that we don't eat the full meal, but we take home some leftovers that we really enjoy later on. If you're at some kind of church gathering that seems to nearly always have food available, you may want to say no to dessert one day or take smaller portions. I've also learned the tip from some people of just leaving some space on the plate between the things that you choose to eat and put on your plate. Particularly with us kind of moving to a different phase of the pandemic and being able to really get back to those regular checkups and screenings, it's really critical to do that. You may have fallen behind on some of those things, and it's important to get caught up, get back in to see your primary care physician and get those checkups and screenings done. This is another one that I have found very helpful to me. Spending time outside every day. There was a Harvard study which showed that spending just about 20 minutes outside in nature actually lowers stress hormones that can be measured in the blood. Now, the picture you see is from my own garden. I was out there one day, and this is in an asparagus patch that is now kind of grown up some for the summer. And I saw this insect there. Some of you know what this is. It's actually an insect that's good to have in your garden. It's called a praying mantis. And it's called a praying mantis because it holds those front legs in sort of a praying position. So right there in nature, I had a reminder of the importance of even spending time in prayer with God. You never know just what you might find and what you might encounter out in God's creation. But that gives us a good transition to the next regular habit of super flourishers. They keep in mind that they are working in alignment with God. And again, this connects back with the work, the information and things that Pam has shared with you. To remember who we serve, remember our values, remember our purpose, and to remember that we are just one part of a much larger process in which only God has the full picture. Some other things that can help us in remembering that we work in alignment with God is planning time for personal spiritual check-ins, personal renewal, taking those opportunities to do that on a regular basis. And then I'm sharing here just kind of a little saying that came to me that I developed during my ministry years whenever I was actively serving local churches. And that was simply to show up, be faithful, and leave the rest up to God. And then there was also a prayer that I came across in a preaching journal. And it was simply this: "Dear God, the church is yours. I'm going to bed." I actually had that printed up and framed and put on my bedside table to try to help remind me that it's not just up to me. It was not all on my shoulders, that I was in this with God. Ultimately, it's God's church, and I was seeking to be a part of it in partnership with God. But there came a point where it was time to go to bed and just let God take it for the night so that I could then be rested. Then the fourth practice they found with super flourishers was positive connections with others. And they found that although many of us may tend to have the practice of just, getting on the phone and sharing those struggles, those frustrations that we're having, they found that super flourishers also share the joys, the victories, the successes. So they're sharing that balance of experiences. They found that they also create rituals to maintain those important connections with those special friends in our lives. Perhaps it's scheduling an annual retreat with that group. Or this weekend, I'm about to go back to Texas and celebrate a birthday with a longtime friend and other good friends down there. So it's doing those things to help maintain the connections. Finding a mentor or a coach to meet with on a regular basis to help share what's going on and have that outside voice that can hopefully help present an objective view for us, or a viewpoint that we may not have considered. It's also very important that we be accountable to someone in our lives, a friend or a spouse who helps us in maintaining those boundaries and those healthy practices that can help us to be at our best for serving, for fulfilling the purpose that we have, for living with integrity. And it's also critical to have at least one person in our lives in whom we can confide and be honest with the personal challenges that we may be experiencing, and to have a regular schedule of talking with that person on a regular basis. So these are just a few practices that they actually found in the research that seem to really help these super flourishers to help address stress in their lives, to help keep it within a reasonable level, to not allow that stress container to just completely fill up and overflow. And of course, there are days that we all do better with this than others. So that is why it is so important for us to have those others in our lives to help us and for us to help them in return. So I just want to leave you with a few thoughts or questions to reflect on that you may want to think about as you go forward from this workshop and seek to put some of these practices into place in your own life that you may find helpful. You know, who can be your ally? Who can be that coach or mentor or support person or confidant to you? Whose support do you need in order to make this work? Is there a conversation that you need to have with someone in your life to help better communicate your values, your priorities, and maybe find a better way to set some boundaries that may need to be established or reestablished perhaps. And remember that calendar, to mark on it even the little things so that you're reminded of it, so that you know that it's important and are more likely to carry through and follow through with those intentional behaviors. Then I want to just leave you with a couple of resources that you might want to look for. If you go to our westpath.org website, you can find more information about the Clergy Wellbeing Survey, but by just putting Wellbeing Survey in the search box. If you want to find those recordings of the First Aid for Mental Health webinars, again, in the search box, you can just put in First Aid for Mental Health event page, and it will have those recordings there. And then I also have a link for the Duke Clergy Health Initiative. You could also probably just put Duke Clergy Health Initiative in the search box of your browser and find more information there. Again, I want to thank you for your time, and I want to ask God's blessing to be with all of you and each of your ministries as you go forward from this workshop. Thank you so much.